Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to session B of the Breaking Bad Boundaries, Thinking and Doing In and Out of the Box Simmons Graduate Symposium. I'm Susan Alden, and I'm a fellow SLIS graduate student, and I will be your moderator today for these very fascinating talks. First up, we have Coolidge Toker. She's a graduate student in the Library Science and Children's Literature departments. Her research interests include knowledge, society discourse, linguistics, performativity, mimesis, the intellectual commons, and systems theory in literature. And she is presenting agency in the Foretold, agency in narrative construction, naming and claiming the Anna in Jane Yolen's Sister Light, Sister Dark. Welcome.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about prophecy and archetypal theory and feminism and stuff. It's be really prophecy in Jane Yolen's great Alta books, far from narrativization of established fated events, is to be read on the slant. It is, as Lavoie says, open to interpretation and so to manipulation by anyone on any side. As such, the archetypal trope of prophecy, supposedly guiding the narrative of Yolen's heroine, proves to be a fluid construct that the characters manipulate with varying levels of intentionality and success as they struggle to control their own narratives and establish a degree of agency within the novel. The power a character wields over the nebulous prophecy comes to mirror the degree of agency she exerts in the ongoing construction of the narrative, thereby transforming a fixed understanding of fate into a powerful means of asserting agency from the periphery. Drawing on archetypal and deconstruction literary theories, as well as performative theories of agency and power, we're going to examine a complicated and ongoing renegotiation of meaning and individual agency in what I consider to be a classic of young adult fantasy literature. In trading breadth for depth, we're going to look only at three characters, the main character Jenna, and the two priestesses who exercise power over her, both personally and as the political and spiritual leaders of her community. Each of the three characters' agency is expressed through and limited by her relationship to the Anna prophecy, which foretells the coming of a white babe, Great Alta's only daughter, who will begin the world anew. So in defining our terms, agency is something that I would like to conceptualize here as strongly tied to the possession of epistemic power, by which I mean the degree to which one can shape the relationship between signifiers, the language used to express the ideas in play. The network of relationships between signifiers is what comprises the discursive reality that forms and delineates the space within which characters can exert whatever agency they have at their disposal. In the deconstructivist understanding of discourse, we're dealing with a signifier that has been completely dislodged from what structuralists would have called its signified, the originary thing or concept the signifier is meant to point to. So what does that do for us here? It allows or forces us to focus on the relationships between signifiers. So these relationships create a chain of signification that is irreducibly linear and forward progressing through a sequence of temporal associations. As such, meaning, and in this case specifically the meaning of prophecy in the title Anna, and whether Jenna is the Anna, is highly contextual both temporally and semantically. The erasure of the signified also creates the need to deny our common understanding of genesis or causation, and instead acknowledge that meaning or action doesn't derive from an antecedent cause as its effect, but rather that meaning emerges as difference within a temporal field. Every iteration of the prophecy is subtly different from the iteration immediately preceding it, and so on down the temporally located chain of meaning. All right. So to this understanding of discourse, I would like to add performative theories of identity creation. As exemplified in the work of Butler and Foucault. So these two have argued successfully, I believe, that identity is a matter of discourse. It's something that arises out of language, through circulated knowledge for Foucault and through performativity for Butler. Power is therefore enforced or seized through the circulation and distribution of knowledge which is discursive in nature and enforces its norms for all of us. The way in which a basic concept can be deployed, understood, and manipulated is the exercise of power knowledge. The interaction of these ideas, the unending chain of signification, the performative nature of identity, and the refusal not just of the primacy of the original, but also its very existence, is what I like to call the fray of iterability. Each repetition remakes and reinterprets cultural norms and expectations as they're embodied in the prophecy. Not only can you never know its true meaning, but there is no true meaning. The power it represents is completely up for grabs. So, for those of you not familiar with the story, the Altites' goddess-based religion and culture is the site of the Anna prophecy. It exists in the shadow of a violent patriarchal Garunian society, currently ruled by the usurping warlord Callis and his 5 beastly sons. The prophecy is present both in Altian and Garunian lore, and it foretells the coming of the Anna, an avatar of the Great Alta, who heralds the time of endings, a new age in which presumably Altites will no longer be confined to the outskirts of society, and the gendered injustices of their religion and society will be redressed. The Altite society is organized into communities called hames, each of which is presided over by a priestess called the Mother Alta. In addition to the protagonist Jenna, who is fostered by the community at Selden's hame, we'll be interrogating the Mother Alta of Selden's hame, who simultaneously is the first to locate Jenna in the prophecy, and the one who refuses to publicly acknowledge Jenna's place in it, and Mother Alta of Nil's hame, who's the first to publicly name Jenna the Anna, and inserts her forcibly into the prophecy narrative. As we explore the extent and mechanics of the epistemic struggles for agency and power over the prophecy, I'd like you all to consider whether any of this is applicable to the discussion surrounding the agency of young people, more broadly speaking, today. Can we glean from Jenna's experience anything for use for those of us who consider ourselves advocates for children and young adults? So who is the Anna, and who seeks to claim her? The role and power of the Anna, as a title, is completely open to culturally specific meanings and competing political interpretations. And because the import of the title is never definitively established, anyone is able to make a fair crack at it. Does the Anna symbolize the end of the era or the beginning of a new one? As the avatar of their goddess, is she a champion defending her culture? What power does she have to determine the outcome of the turning? As a harbinger, it's uncertain. The prophecy only promises change. Because the 3 characters we're focusing on are all of Altite religion, the prophecy itself, as something written in their religious book of light, is never thought to be anything but of divine providence. Despite this, however, the Mother Altas each have their own agenda in either confirming or denying that the Anna exists in their time, and specifically in the person of Jenna. The change is alternately called the turning. So what the Anna is the harbinger of is called the turning. A phrase which evokes a relatively benign shift or realignment of social reality. The difference between carrying on as one has been, presumably in a straight, unwavering line, and adjusting a bit to the left or the right. Approaching the turning is positive, not necessarily a cause for concern. However, at points, the turning becomes this turning, a semantic change that suddenly refashions the straight, broad, flat road of the past into a winding road of cyclical, patterned turns. In both cases, the vision is one of a road or path with particular, already marked out opportunities for deviating from the current trajectory. Even if we can't see the future, we know a turn is approaching, and there's a divinely sanctioned Anna who will play a role in ensuring society navigates the turn, gracefully or no. Each of these iterations, and others external to the specific context shared by these 3 characters, are imprinted on the signifiers turning and Anna, magnifying the ambiguity of the prophecy and providing the characters with the epistemic space to promote their own interpretation and the possibilities for individual and collective agency that interpretation provides for or curtails. So if we look specifically at the Mother Alta of Selden's hame, she's the Mother Alta that Jenna grows up with and has a much longer relationship with. She's publicly authoritative and privately uncertain, struggling with the sense that what authority remains vested in her should be exercised to the greatest possible effect, both for the ultimate benefit of those in her care and the preservation of her authority within the Haim system. Because she's deeply married to this idea of herself as the Mother Alta, and this is something that she really can't deal with that meaning changing. That's not something she's willing to even think about. The relationship between Mother Alta and the young Jenna seems to mirror the apprehension felt by children as they begin to move into the adult world and the conflicting desires of the adults closest to them to both mourn and embrace. Thus, the adult is exposed to the child as flawed and particular, far from the selfless, omnipotent guardian Mother Alta wishes to be seen as. Mother Alta publicly espouses the hidden logic of authority, as she does when she tells Jenna and the other children in her care that sometimes Great Alta tests us, and we are too small to see the pattern. All we feel is the pain, but there is a pattern, and that you must believe. She is always careful publicly to place herself firmly in the seat of authority as someone for whom the test is not a test, refusing to acknowledge the deep doubt and insecurity she displays in private. Mother Alta is torn between the desire to claim two different kinds of authority: the agency that particular source of authority can provide. She would like to be the one to name Jenna as the prophesied White Anna, to be known as the one responsible for nurturing Jenna and presenting her to the community as their savior. But she fears doing so without a clear sign from the goddess, by which, of course, I mean that she fears disrupting her current source of authority as the infallible voice and representative of Great Alta in her community. Mother Alta is disappointed by what she sees as Jenna's fallibility, her humanity. Most important to her is that for all Jenna's extraordinary qualities, she did not choose the path of priestess, which Mother Alta firmly believes is the only position of true authority and the only way to be a representative, not to mention avatar of the goddess. Ultimately, Mother Alta works to convince herself that Jenna is just a child, to quote, denying the possibility that the sacred and profane can coexist, and reducing the scope of her own agency by so thoroughly aligning it with the unsupportable condition of her own infallibility as the priestess and representative of Alta. So now we're going to move to the Mother Alta of Nilsheim, and Jenna only knows for a couple days, and she inserts herself very forcibly into the narrative and is the one who decides that Jenna is going to be the Anna of this particular turning. So Mother Alta of Nilsheim is as invested in Jenna being the Anna as the Mother Alta of Seldensheim is in proving that she's not. Not just because she does not deny Jenna the religious and political significance of the Anna title, but however, just because she does not deny Jenna the religious and political significance of the Anna title, doesn't mean that her expression of agency is entirely benevolent. This Mother Alta is very quick to identify Jenna as the Anna. The only definitive sign she needs is the coincidental fact that Jenna has white hair. Jenna, in protest, she sees the prophecy only as an unwanted responsibility that will shorten her childhood and make her immediately responsible for the fate of her friends and family and culture. She demands more proof. My hair is white, so what? After a night of self-reflection, she tells Mother Alta, "I found no greatness in me, only the memories of an ordinary childhood." Mother Alta, however, uses the ambiguity of the prophecy to refuse Jenna's own refusal of the responsibility. What do you think Anna should have? Thunder and lightning at her birth? An animal in the woods to nurse her? Would you recognize it, Jo and Anna, if this something extraordinary happened to you? Don't worry. When you and I are long in the cave, there will be poets and storytellers who will give you such a birth. In the face of Jenna's bald refusal of the call, for want of sufficient divine indication, Mother Alta uses the agency available to her by virtue both of her title and her advanced age and perceived frailty. She's both blind, has 6 fingers on both hands and is strapped into her chair. She's quadriplegic. Okay, so the latter of which grant her more authority in her community and in Jenna's eyes than did the didactic insistence of her own mother altas at Seldenham. She makes this use of this agency to quietly open a new avenue for Jenna to exercise agency from within the bounds of the prophecy. She, Jenna, is not responsible for infusing her actions with the divine. Humanity's natural inclination to fit stories into an archetypal trope will ensure that Jenna's assumption of the title Anna will be thoroughly naturalized. In good time. What Jenna needs to do, regardless, is take action to protect her people from the predations of the mainstream patriarchal society. She needs to provide the focal point that can unite the periphery into a force that can exert agency, first on the battlefield and ultimately in the mainstream political field. In so doing, she crucially provides Jenna with the key to establish agency over the mythological figure, to accepting the role without discounting her own experiences and knowledge of herself. She shares with Jenna and her companions the ambiguity of prophecy and, implicitly, the possibility and importance of establishing control over its interpretation. However, in forcing Jenna to assume the title of the Anna, Mother Alta limits her to a role that first obliterates Jenna's sense of self before giving her the space to truly claim the title and attendant responsibilities to make it her own. Mother Alta's final message is that we must act for now and leave the answers to those who come after. Jenna's experience in the fray of iterability is itself shaped by archetypal tropes and of the refusal of the call, the trials and doubts, and finally a sort of acceptance. Rather than going through the book plot by plot, okay, so I've already talked a bit about how she is treated by her own Mother Alta, and so this is her initial refusal. The ambiguity of her very presence invites the child Jenna to develop and exercise her limited power. So the original Mother Alta's refusal to be human gives Jenna the opportunity to refuse anything other. After having accepted the role, but not the title of Anna, from the Mother Alta of Nilsheim, Jenna is deeply uncertain about her epistemic reality. I know what the Anna is, she says, but I no longer know who I am. By accepting the title of the Anna, she finds herself thrown into the fray of iterability, at once responsible for and answerable to others' needs and expectations of the prophecy. As the Mother Alta of Nilsheim notes, if Jenna is who I say she is, then her future is all of ours. Her future, by extension, is no longer hers or something discrete that she alone is responsible to and for. However, echoing Lavoie's conclusion that prophecy seems merely a form of knowledge informing choice, Mother Alta insists that it is for Jenna to decide who the Anna is. The bards and historians will give her the miraculous birth, the thunder and lightning. Jenna need only assume the authority of the Anna to do what she wants and needs to do.
Well, thank you very much, Emily. I'm a little behind on children's literature. I've been pretty ticky Tembo, no Sarambo. So it's so that was a very different look at children's literature. So I really need to get a little more involved in that. So we're going to save questions to the end, just like in the last panel. Next person up is Nicole Cunha. She's a graduate student at Simmons College in children's literature and library science dual master's program. Her research interests include disability studies, storytelling, and science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM education. She currently works as a Learning Commons assistant at Beatley Library, where she started working as an undergraduate. And she is presenting Censorship of Disabled Characters in Fantasy, what that means for children's literature and libraries. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you, Susan, for that marvelous introduction. So,
Thank you, Robin.
but you gave it voice. I really want to make this a conversation rather than a presentation today, because over the last year, I've realized that we have one area of children's literature that isn't really talked about: disability. We've talked a lot about, or there is a lot of research on LGBTQIA characters in children's lit. There's race and ethnicity and intersectionality of those topics, but there's not much on disability itself, and even on the intersectionality within those other groups that I just mentioned. So I want to start off with, what do you guys think disability is, or where do you think it would fit in with children's lit? Yeah, I'm going to throw this one out there for you guys. Yes.
You go ahead. Well, I was just thinking, I think that characters with disability fit everywhere in literature, just like they fit everywhere in the universe. And so I was thinking that one of my most recent favorite representations was Alvin Ho's friend in those books. And so I like how they make her just like cool. Like it's just, they don't like they don't draw so much attention to this as being a disability, but just part of who she is as a person. And so I really liked that representation of it. And it was one of few of quality characters with disabilities that I feel like I've seen in children's lit.
That's a great example. And then I believe you have one.
Very similar response, but I think especially in picture books, it would be great to have characters with disabilities who were just in the picture book. The storyline isn't necessarily about the disability, but they're just there. The one that comes to mind is the second Molly Lou Mellon book. I don't know if anyone knows those, but the second, there's two of them, and the second one, her friend is on crutches, and that's just, it's never mentioned, it's just there for kids to kind of see as a normal thing.
So that's another point of discussion I want to get to, at least in the future, is how do we see disability in reality, in our world, and in literature? Do we see it as just a character that the disability is part of who they are, as in the Alvin Ho books? Or do we see it as something that's not talked about at all? And part of the research that I've done is looking at the history of disability in children's lit. So I know in the program it said I'm looking at the Little Lame Prince and his traveling cloak, Gathering Blue in Graceling, but I admit Graceling is a bit more of an adventure than I immediately thought of when I wrote this proposal. So I'm just focusing on the other two right now. So we have one for 19th century and one for 20th century. And I am still looking at this kind of as ongoing research. So that's the reason why I want to make it a discussion. But at the time when I wrote this, I was looking more at the disabilities as physical and mental. I wasn't really thinking about the social impact, the cultural impact, and what we could say for the readers and what the authors were thinking of when they wrote these books. So to get started, I would have to say for 19th century and 20th century, that some of the characterizations we see are of just, how do I want to put this? A very surface kind of characterization. If anyone knows Rubin and Watson, their article Disability Bias, they might be aware of some of the stuff. That is a great article, I recommend it, of that these characters are just evil, just good. Their characterization is just burdens that people have to deal with. They see themselves as burdens. And then these are just a couple of the stereotypes that I've talked about. And starting with the Little Lame Prince, I want to look at kind of how does he see himself, how does society see himself, or see him as a character, and how does the author kind of position him within the construction of the text, and wants him as a character for Has anyone read this before? It's from the 1800s, so I'm just asking. Okay. So basically, Prince Dolor, his name is even a misnomer, not a misnomer, but a discussion here. He was born early. His mother died soon after the birth, and he was a beautiful baby, but his legs were deformed when he was born, so that they weren't fully grown. And part of the narrative that Crick talks about is how he copes with that. Maybe copes isn't even the right word, but how he gets around that kind of obstacle. But part of what the narrative talks about is how he is a pitiable character, how he's a poor prince, a dear prince, how he is thrust out of his kingdom and kind of pushed off as he's not able to rule his people because of this disability, versus his uncle who takes up the throne and says, I'm able to do this because I am a fully formed, fully able person. And part of the narrative is him trying to figure out how to deal with this. How does he see himself in this disability? Is it a disability? How do his family see him? How does society see him? So, is anyone confused right now? Do I need to clear anything up? Okay. So, what I am trying to get here, I'm a little nervous, so just bear with me, is Crick's narrative focuses on empathy. Empathy for the character, empathy for the society, and just how the reader sees him, all these different positions that are in the text. And one character that is very pivotal for Prince Dolor, as well as for the reader, I think, is his grandmother, or his godmother, who gives him this traveling cloak. This traveling cloak enables him to get out of the tower that his uncle builds for him to try to keep him trapped within one small world, and enables him to see all these other parts of society, of his kingdom, and then beyond that, and be able to see how do other people live. Because the only world he knows is his, on dealing with, working with his two hands to get around the tower, or working with his cloak to have him travel. He doesn't really know other people of able-bodiedness to walk on two legs. So a narrative is very much like, this is his position of, this is his normality, and then he sees people of other abilities, but his ability isn't a disability, it's a different ability. So it's shifting that viewpoint, that perception. And just the breakdown of these different barriers in text for him, and then him coming back into society and reintroducing himself into society, how his subjects don't talk about his disability. And then, but not in a bad way. Some people may not feel very comfortable about it, but they don't see his disability at all, because they see him. They see his entire entire personhood, to use a simple term. And the transformation from using this cloak to see a gigantic worldview to using crutches is another example of, you have to shift your viewpoint in order to understand other people. But you have to make sure you understand where your viewpoint is yourself. And a few things I want to look at in relation to the other text I'm looking at, Gathering Blue, is the same kind of thing. Is this kind of viewpoint a similar pattern? from his tower and then from his kingdom, and he wants to just explore on his own. So part of what I want to look at for Gathering Blue is how these characters and how the readers, again, can kind of expand that viewpoint, how we can see not just a point of hope at the end of the books, but a point of getting us to think about all these things. I know I might be repeating, but it's just a point I want you to think about. If you have any questions, let me know. Is everyone following me okay? Am I repeating myself too much? Okay. So I'm going to move on to Gathering Blue, and then if you have any questions at the end, feel free to say, I didn't understand this, let me know. So for Gathering Blue, you have Kira. At the beginning of the text, Kira is sitting in the, I'm trying to remember the exact name, I believe it's the field of mourning for her society. It's where all the dead go, and where the family go to watch over the dead. So we don't find out Kira's, I don't want to say malady, her deformity, or anything like that, her difference until a few pages in, that she walks with a profound limp, and her mother was the only one to really advocate for her position in society. And everyone else was very much like, she is not of use to us, we should leave her for the fields of mourning, the fields of death, all of this. And that point is, they don't want anything beyond their idea of normalcy in society whatsoever. I will get into more of what that means in the future, but there's a build-up, I promise. And the transition with this is that once her mother dies, she is approached to become part of a kind of group for the government. Has anyone read this book before? Or The Giver, anything like that? So if you know, her society is called The Village. It's a dystopian society. I should have said it's a science fiction and fantasy kind of examination here, but and her role becomes not just part of her village, but a part of the entire government, as she's one of the people that must perpetuate this kind of history that they have. And her role changes is not to look at, she is a burden, and the society sees her as a burden, because we see her right before being accused by one of the other villagers, another woman, to not contributing anything. And it's after this that we see one of the government officials approach her and say, we know you have this very good skill of sewing, and we want you to become a part of our inner group to get this, to become this kind of revered figure. So, in short, her sewing has nothing to do with her feet, and the kind of positionality shifts from her as a burden to her as a worker. She can become part of society, become someone useful, and part of the narrative is her shifting that idea of, yes, I do eat a lot of food, I do not contribute a lot to the field, to I have this skill, my mother taught me this skill, which I can contribute. I can perpetuate the future that they want us to hold. And looking at this, it's kind of, let me look at this. Are these characters pitiable? Are they treated kindly? Are they ostracized? And how are they within the perception of their disability and within society themselves? With Prince Galore, he is ostracized and isolated physically by he's being taken out. And then he comes back and the society shifts. With Kira, she is ostracized within the society and then taken out and brought back in within this new positionality of revered figure. So I figure? And what do I think of myself? And the whole idea of disability, look at it, is not just who you are as a person, but it's just how does the society, or how does the construction, position that as well. So I'm looking at historically, where does that shift it? I have a lot of ideas, so if I'm going all over the place, feel free to ask me afterward. I would love to talk about this. But kind of what I'm looking at is how do we talk about disability within libraries, and how does this historical perception within literature and within our own study of literature and disability kind of shape our idea of it in our reality, and how can we get, as adults and as librarians, educators, to kind of reframe it for ourselves, but also for children. Because the earlier that we find their positionality and kind of reshape it, the sooner we can reshape societies. So does anyone have any questions for me, or anything that I didn't touch on? Okay, anything that you guys have been thinking about with disability, or kind of questions you've had? Anything? Characters? Yep.
I'm wondering if, I know this is sort of like beginning of the research and there's a lot more to come, but I'm wondering if you're interested in sort of exploring the like magical disability trope at all, which I know like you haven't gotten to, but it comes up a lot in Graceland. It's like kind of a...
Well, I should have touched upon that, so thank you for bringing it up.
Not that you should have now, but I'm just curious if that's like something
No,
that...
that is definitely something that I'm there, so looking at within this. Again, I've had so many different things, I'm just like, how am I going to fit this into 15 minutes? But what this lovely lady was talking about, or participant, is the magical cure, or even technical cure, if you're looking at it through a sci-fi perspective. How do we enforce this idea of normalcy? Do we have a cure of people can magically walk, or we can build them like a suit or a spaceship that harbors their brain, their intelligence, to help them get around this kind of obstacle that they have. And part of what I was going to look at here, and I didn't bring up, was that for Prince Delore, there's no fix to his disability. The cloak becomes his way of broadening his perception that helps him figure out his perception of disability. And the crutches enable him to move around physically. But there's no, I'm going to give you a new set of legs to make you seem, I have 2 arms, 2 legs, I can now get around. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yep.
That is actually touching on what I was thinking the entire time, because I was thinking about the magical cure over the course of your talk, and I noticed that you seem to have very particularly chosen 2 books where that's not the case, and where it seems like very positive perspectives, and I'm wondering if you see both of those characters as positive, and the direction that you think more of this children's literature should go in.
I would definitely say that it has a positive line to it, in that how they wrote these characters, Prince Delore was used to create empathy for the reader and have him learn empathy. So he's used as a construction of the author to teach, and that's one kind of area that I may not have touched on, is that they're used as tools. And Kira is very much the same thing in her society of, she's a tool of the government, but it's all about her kind of reframing. So I would say that it definitely has a positive track in creating ways that people can think about disability and think about, how do I see these different things? more on the positive line, because we're, I would say, in academia, we are reframing and seeing where our obstacles are. So it's just showing just the progression that we've made. Does that answer your question?
Moving along. All right, thank you very much, Nicole, and it was very engaging, and I felt the little child in me would be just so pleased to have a story told by you, or just... Okay, one more, and there'll be, you guys are doing great with time, so there'll be room for questions at the end. So last but not least, Celeste. Celeste is a first-year dual degree student in the Library Science and Children's Literature graduate program. She holds a BA in Anthropology and Religious Studies and MA in Southern Asian Studies. Her current interests include diversity in children's literature, gender representation in picture books, and baking chocolate chip cookies.
I should have brought cookies, I would have been more popular. I have things, I don't know how to make them happen up there.
I love like tech people will help you.
Yay, thank you, tech people. Alright, if you go from here. I just didn't know which button. Yep. Okay. So, my presentation is called Diverse Libraries, Youth Service Librarianship, and Diverse Book Movement. And I would like to begin my presentation with a quote from an author named L006 who writes speculative fiction for both young adults and grown-up adults. And he said that the question industry professionals need to ask themselves is this: how can I use my position to help create a literary world that is diverse, equitable, and doesn't just represent the same segment of society it always has since its inception? What concrete actions can I take to make actual change and move beyond the tired conversation we've been having for decades? So, the lack of diversity within books published for children and young adults has garnered national attention over the past year. The problem is not new, and debates about how to address this lack have come and gone within the field of children's literature, including literary critics, authors, educators, and librarians. L006 addresses his call to action to literary agents and editors. However, youth services librarians, as a different kind of industry professional, can answer this call by seriously considering the impact they have in either promoting change or upholding the status quo. Collection development policies that have a clear commitment to accurately representing the diversity of human experience have the potential to influence publishing industry decisions, promote diverse reading habits among all young people, and counter the systemic biases that lurk behind these dismal publishing statistics. So, in March of 2014, the Cooperative Children's Book Center, or the CCBC, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Education released its annual statistics regarding children's books published by and about people of color. These statistics are based on the picture books, nonfiction, and novels for children and young adults that the CCBC receives directly from publishers, and they get most things, I think, from all of the major publishing houses in the United States, as well as lots of things from smaller publishing houses in both the US and Canada. So in 2013, only 253 of the 3,200 books that they received contained main characters or significant secondary characters of color, making up a measly 7.9% of all books received. While the CCBC does not keep statistics regarding books about white people, a mid-year review excluding books with non-human protagonists or subjects found that only 5.27% of books received that far into 2014 were about people of color. So the reason I mention that is because a lot of people are like, well, aren't a lot of picture books about animals and trucks and dinosaurs, and they don't have race, so really isn't it just that, like, it's because most kids' books aren't about people, and so they went through and looked at it, like, well, first of all, there's like a little percentage of picture books that fit that criteria of not being about people. Most novels and things are in fact about people. So even if you cut out all the stuff that's not about people, the numbers don't get any better. That's basically the gist of that. After the release of these statistics that year, notable children's authors Walter Dean Myers and Christopher Myers published op-eds in the New York Times about the negative effects such publishing disparities have on children of color, sparking a national debate about diversity in children's books. The announcement of an all-white, all-male panel of authors at BookCon's May 31st reader event spawned the We Need Diverse Books hashtag on Twitter, which has since incorporated into a nonprofit campaign, because that's the world we live in now. The publishing statistics for 2014 show an improvement, with 11.3% of books received by the CCBC featuring protagonists of color, and a whopping 8.3% written by authors of color. These percentages still do not come anywhere near an accurate representation of the diversity of the US population. Nor can we tell if this is the beginning of a sea change in the industry or merely a blip that will fade back down into the status quo. So the sort of dashy red line up the top is books about Africans or African Americans. The solid lines are books by people of color. The yellow lines are books by or about American Indians. And the blue ones are Asians, Pacific Americans, and the green one is Latino. So that's what all these colors mean. And this is straight from the CCBC website. The CCBC statistics only provide information about children's books by and or about Africans, African Americans, American Indians, Asian Pacific Americans, and Latinos published in English in the United States. While there are no similarly systematic statistical studies of other axes of diversity, tentative conclusions can be drawn. Author Melinda Lowe analyzed published bibliographies of young adult novels with LGBTQ characters and came to the conclusion that less than 1% of books published in 2010 featured queer protagonists. I could not find any published statistics regarding children's books that feature characters with disabilities as primary characters. However, discussion of inclusion and diversity in children's library services needs to consider all of the axes of identity. The Association for Library Service to Children defines cultural diversity as encompassing ethnicity, race, family composition, ancestry, ability, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, language fluency, citizenship status, religious preference, age, gender expression, educational level, and domicile. So even though there has been less research and emphasis on disability or sexuality in children's literature or socioeconomic status, religious diversity, librarians providing services to children need to keep these aspects of diversity in mind when developing their collections as well. So why do we need diversity? Why does this matter? Christopher Myers argues that the paucity of characters of color in children's books, particularly outside of historical books dealing with civil rights and slavery, affects children of color in two ways. The first is to create a gap in the much written about sense of self-love that comes from recognizing yourself in a text. The publication of books about Black children or queer children or children with disabilities affirms the importance of readers who share the identity categories of these characters. Christopher Myers focuses more on this second effect of whitewashed children's literature. We adults, parents, authors, illustrators, and publishers give them, children, in each book, a world of supposedly boundless imagination that can delineate the most ornate geographies, and yet too often today's books remain blind to the everyday realities of thousands of children. Excluding children of color from the cartography of imagination limits the imaginative frameworks available for envisioning their future. It damages white children by leaving them without tools for understanding difference. Walter Dean Myers, another very famous African-American children's author, also uses cartographic imagery in discussing the importance of recognizing yourself in both characters and the authors who write them. In describing reading Sonny's Blues by author James Baldwin, Walter Dean Myers notes, "The story gave me permission I didn't know I needed, the permission to write about my own landscape, my own map. These maps are important," Walter Dean Myers argues, in order to validate people of color as human beings. Within the library context specifically, the Association for Library Services to Children notes that when children do not see themselves represented on the shelves, they receive a resounding message that the librarian does not think that their culture is important enough to feature in the library. Diverse literature is important for all young readers, not only minority readers. The ALSC notes that providing readers with diverse literature promotes cultural competence. If children are not exposed to the lives, cultures, and languages of children from around the world, they miss the opportunity to learn how to function in a culturally pluralistic world. This relates back to Christopher Myers' insistence that literature must provide a range of imaginative vistas for children in order to teach them how to interact in the world. However, I would caution against advocating for diversity in children's literature based primarily on its utility in educating white kids to be good multicultural citizens. Given that the absence of people of color in children's literature relates directly to histories of white supremacy and racial oppression, transforming the world of children's publishing requires a commitment to confronting racism. So drawing on research on implicit racism, Noah Berlatsky argues that promoting diversity in children's literature is a critical part of an anti-racist project. Berlatsky uses a Perception Institute report called Addressing Implicit Bias, Racial Anxiety, and Stereotype Threat in Education and Healthcare. The report places the deaths of Michael Brown, John Crawford, and Eric Gardner at the hands of white police officers into the larger context of racism in the United States. The authors argue that people's implicit biases, the unconscious applications of stereotypes or negative attitudes, often contradict their consciously held ideals about racial equality. What that basically means is that lots of people, most people, when asked, right, will say, oh yeah, I'm not a racist, I think everybody should be treated equally. That's not how the world actually operates. So, this idea that all of us have sort of these deep-seated, unconscious stereotypes in the backs of our brains is what they refer to as implicit biases. And unfortunately, these implicit biases have greater predictive value than consciously held ideals for behaviors ranging from incorrectly assessing facial expressions to acts of violence. So when tested, people will often say the same facial expression looks angrier on a black face than it looks on a white face. For example, they will be more likely to feel that a young black man is a threat than a white man walking down the street. And they would not consciously say that, but their behavior, our behavior, plays that out. So this helps explain why structural racism persists even when most people profess to believe in racial and ethnic equality. Implicit biases also lie behind microaggressions, the brief and everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to people of color because they are members of a minority group. And these terms apply to us. So while the Perception Institute study focuses on the importance of direct intergroup contact to reduce racial anxiety, that is, the discomfort that both white and black people often feel in interacting with each other, Berlatsky argues that diversity in children's literature gives white children a chance to see black people and people of color as something other than anxiety-producing others or stereotypes. In other words, reading about people from various other backgrounds can supplement personal interactions. The insights from the Perception Institute report are based on racial biases, stereotypes, and anxieties, but can be extended to other kinds of biases. If reading books with black heroes and protagonists can help diffuse racial anxiety, counter stereotypes, and diffuse the negative effects of racism, then reading books about queer people or differently abled people can counter stereotypes in those arenas. Thus, promoting diversity in children's literature works to decrease injustices and increase equity throughout American culture. What is the role of libraries in all of this? What role should public libraries in general and youth services librarians in particular play in the campaign for diversity in children's literature? Libraries are providers of information resources, not publishers or creators of intellectual content. Librarians can and do, however, purchase and promote books and other resources. Through collection development, library programming, and readers advisory, youth services librarians are in a unique position to affect what children read, which can in turn exert pressure on the publishing industry to provide more diverse books. Some people may argue that using our position as librarians to influence what children read would be a violation of the American Library Association's Code of Ethics. Section 7 states that we distinguish between our personal conviction and professional duties and do not allow our personal beliefs to interfere with fair representation of the aims of our institutions or the provision of access to their information resources. While youth services librarians may have a personal commitment to promoting diversity, the argument goes that commitment should be left at the library door when the librarian comes to work. However, the ALA Code of Ethics specifies that librarians' personal beliefs should not interfere with providing access to information resources. I argue that a commitment to diversity does not interfere with librarians' duties. Instead, such a commitment is necessary to live up to the goal of providing equitable access to information resources. And in fact, the ALA considers diversity to be one of its fundamental values and has adopted it as one of the 8 key action areas to guide its investment of energy and resources. The ALA's commitment to diversity can be seen in the existence of the Ethnic and Multicultural Roundtable and the Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual and Transgender Roundtable. If youth services librarians take the ALA's commitment to equity seriously, then we must also take the campaign for diverse books seriously. After all, libraries can only provide access to information and materials that are published. Increasing the publication of materials that more accurately represent the breadth of human experience will enable librarians to better serve our patrons. Youth services librarians should remain committed to providing service to underserved and minority populations, but should also consider the library's role in building a society that is more aware and understanding of differences between cultures. In other words, youth services librarians need to recognize the role diverse collections play in reducing racism and implicit biases noted above. Diverse collections are therefore necessary not only in urban areas or other areas with diverse populations, but rather should be seen as a priority even where the patron population is fairly homogeneous. Collection development provides a rich opportunity for supporting publication of diverse books. The relationship between children's libraries and children's publishers is interdependent, with libraries depending on publishers' materials and publishers relying on libraries for a steady market. According to a library fact sheet on marketing to libraries, public libraries nationally spent a total of $1.23 billion on collection expenditures. While this figure is a small total of the market share, public libraries can and should commit to making every dollar count. Collection development policies should contain a commitment to building collections that are representative of local and national diversity. To quote Kathleen Horning, the director of the Children's Cooperative Book Council, if we want to see change, if we want to see more diversity in literature, we have to buy the books. Given the lack of diversity within the library profession, the mostly white, able-bodied librarians in charge of collection development may struggle with how to assess multicultural materials. Denise Augusto offers advice to school librarians, which is also applicable to youth services librarians in the public sector. Multicultural materials should portray various cultures accurately, include pronunciation guides for non-English terms, demonstrate authorial expertise, whether gained through research into another culture or through first-hand experience as a member of a minority group, should show respect for the culture depicted and meet the same standards of quality that all materials are held to. They need to reflect diversity within groups as well as across groups, and adequately capturing intra-group diversity, that is, diversity within various populations, also speaks to the need for greater numbers of diverse books. If you only have one book in your collection about a certain population, that book then stands as like the book about these people and presents their experiences much more homogeneous than it actually is. And there are a number of guides that are available for helping librarians find and purchase and evaluate diverse books. So part of what librarians need to do is organize to advocate for increased budgets for material acquisition. Kathleen Horning argues that the robust library markets helped pave the way for a surge in multicultural children's books in the 1950s or the 1960s and 70s. And while we probably can't recapture the days before bookstore giants like Barnes & Noble entered the scene, we can assert ourselves as a significant cultural force. Bringing more diversity into library collections may also involve larger systemic changes in the way libraries operate. While there is currently a trend towards centralized collection development in order to increase efficiency, such policies can have detrimental effects on the diversity of collections as purchasing decisions are taken out of the hands of people who know the specific needs of the community. In contrast, a decentralized selection of materials with centralized oversight can make sure the needs of the community are met within the constraints of the budget. So simply purchasing diverse books will only have a limited effect if these books never reach the hands of our patrons. So diverse books need to be worked into story times, reader advisory, and other library programs. Graphic material displayed in the library should also represent diversity. Book talks, book reviews, reading groups, and collaboration with teachers and schools can increase the impact of libraries' diverse collections. Librarians must read diverse books and get to know them well enough to recommend them to all readers during reader advisory, not just because they are multicultural, but because they are good books. Recommending and promoting diverse books to all readers can influence the popularity of books among a wide readership, which may in turn affect bookstore sales of diverse books. So in conclusion, the United States is an increasingly diverse country. 1 in 3 U.S. residents identify as something other than whites. Almost 13% live below the poverty level. 19% of people over the age of 5 speak a language other than English at home, and 11% of children ages 6 to 14 have some form of disability. This is from 2007, so those numbers are probably a lot of data. Given this climate, it is unconscionable that the number of children's books by and about people of color has remained stagnant at about 10% for the last 20 years, and the number of children's books about people with disabilities remains so minuscule as to not merit statistics. Increasing the diversity of children's literature cannot merely be a politically correct gesture towards the inclusion of a slightly higher number of token authors and characters of color, disability, or gender and sexual nonconformity. A true commitment to diversity in literature requires a commitment to undoing structural inequalities that lie at the heart of the publishing industry and American society as a whole. Because public libraries seek to provide equitable access to information resources, youth services librarians have a stake in creating a body of children's literature that is truly representative of the depth and breadth of human experience. We cannot provide access to materials that do not exist, and providing equitable services to all patrons means making sure all of our patrons can see themselves reflected in library materials. By recommending diverse books widely, librarians can change the literary culture that assumes that books about white people are for everyone, but books about people of color are only of interest to readers of color.
All right, thank you very much, Les. Well, that leaves the panel open for questions, but I think we should give them all a round of applause. Fire away.
I have a question for Nicole. So you mentioned something just briefly at the beginning about books representing physical and mental disability, and I was straining my brain to think of an example of a book that represented a mental disability, and I was wondering if you could help me out here. You know, just yeah.
Okay. One that I've read recently that I absolutely loved was Girls Like Us by Gail Giles. I believe it actually won the 2014 National Book Award. I know that Disability and Kidlit, the blog, they also have a ton of different books with disabled characters that they categorize for mental, physical. They have a ton of different categories. I think what else is there? And then what I'm going to want to read, I forget the author at this point, but Out of My Mind, I've heard is another very good one. And if I can think of any others, I will let you know.
So I'm actually here as an English teacher, not as a librarian. I taught Out of My Mind last year. The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime was another book.
I don't have a question, but just a comment, because I think particularly in your both your presentations were so informative and shocking. I think that there's been so little change over time, and I think you bring up the curious case of the dog in the nighttime, which made me think about these staggering numbers of children being diagnosed with on the autism spectrum today, and how will they see themselves represented in children's letters? How will they be able to access these characters, or just being able to have children of all abilities be able to see themselves in children's books and feel like that they're safe places for them. I have a nephew with a disability. I want him to feel comfortable in the library. I want him to be able to identify with characters and not only look at able-bodied people and think I'm deficient somehow because my arm doesn't work the same way or my speech doesn't come out the same way as other people. And so I just think that this was really informative for me as a future youth services librarian to really pay attention to making sure that collections are addressing all people of all abilities and races and everything. I think this idea of we need these representations so that all of us are better people, I think, in the long run.
I mean, going on with that comment, that's great. Thank you very much for saying that. But part of my reason for writing the research I did is because I never really found a lot of people with my own disabilities. I have cerebral palsy and slow processing disorder. So part of the reasons why I applied for the Censorship program was to find where I fit in this and where can I help get these points of discussion out there.
dad had a disability. My dad had cerebral palsy, and he, the way that he, this was a long time ago, but I think that was perceived, how disabilities are perceived also. So the idea, like growing up, I would be like, there's nothing wrong with my dad's brain. People would think that he had an intellectual disability because his body didn't move the same way. And so he wasn't educated the same way as his brothers and sisters because of these understandings. And I think a lot of that still hasn't changed, and it has to.
That's very true. I mean, the two figures that come to mind right now for me are, or three actually, Sherman Alexie, who also has cerebral palsy, epilepsy. Read The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and you'll get a lot of the autobiographical things there. But also, like, think of Stephen Hawking or Christy Brown in My Left Foot. Like, if we didn't know these people as highly intellectual and highly capable of doing these things, how would we perceive them now versus then? And just so many discussions for history right now that we go into. But it is really just looking at perception. It's not the disability shouldn't define who we are. It's the perception and the construction of what society says. That's what creates this disability. So it's just, these barriers, they're so much fun to deconstruct.
I think, Celeste, you touched on this briefly, but could you all kind of talk about the difference between having books about children of color that only deal with civil rights, or a book that's only about Chinese New Year, or something like that, versus just children's books that happen to have characters that look different?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's essential, right? And a lot of the research on picture books in particular, but I think children's books more broadly talk about that, right? That we have this sort of historical sense, especially for African Americans, right? That there's lots and lots of books about civil rights and the Underground Railroad because it's dramatic, and but it also then places people of color like squarely in the past, right? Or you'll have books on Chinese New Year or Cinco de Mayo or whatever, and like it's sort of holiday multiculturalism, or people talk about it as cultural tourism. Where all of the books about people of color are about the holidays they celebrate, the food they eat, and the focus then becomes on look at how different they are, right? And it's really important to acknowledge differences, right? One of the things you don't want to do is silence that. But when that's all that there is, then the commonality of the human experience gets completely erased too. And so yeah, books where you just have, hey, I'm a character and this is, where I happen to fit on all of these various axes of identity. And yeah, all of those are very relevant to my experience, right? What you don't want is a character where like you could just change the illustration and, in this issue of the book it's an African American character, and the next one is gonna be a Latina, and then the next one maybe she'll be Asian, and like the story could remain the same because that's not really authentic either. But you want stories that are just about people living their lives and on, various kinds of people living their various kinds of lives.
I would also recommend looking at stories that deal with these characters kind of grappling with the different identities of like, where do I fit with my mother culture, and where do I fit in the American culture, whatever culture they're living in. Two authors that came to my mind immediately are Jean Luen Yang. He's a huge Asian American graphic novelist. Trying to think, what's the name of his?
American War Chinese.
Yes, American War Chinese is great. And then all of his other works have characters that grapple with this kind of identity of, also Shadow Hero. That's a very new one. That it's him kind of repurposing the history that America presents in the 1950s and the comics that they made, but kind of redesigning it to show these are the points that we had to grapple with. These are the points that were characterized, and this is where we're reclaiming our culture and showing that we can do these things in the same way at the same time.
An article that I ran across too recently to actually include in this paper was talking about psychological research done on groups of children who were read to little kids books about cross-racial friendships and kids just playing together versus kids who were just read books about homogenous groups playing, and how that affected those kids' willingness and ability to actually play across racial lines. And they found that there was in fact a lasting effect, that kids who were read to books in which kids are just playing together across racial lines, and it's not books about how, this kid struggled and fought to be allowed to be included in this other group, right? But just everyday kids playing together in everyday ways were much more able and willing to cross racial lines in their own play, even 6 months after the study ended. The depressing thing about the study was that the people who did it had very strict criteria of what it means for a picture book to actually include that kind of play, and they had like 5 examples. So it's really hard. It's really hard to find, but it speaks to the importance of that kind of literature.
My brain is just shutting off today. But I was actually going to mention that a lot of the literature I found for inclusion of disabled characters in books and how to get school librarians and what was the other article? To talk about building up these collections is about, I should say, the exposure. That's the most important point. Is the earlier you have this exposure in any capacity, whether it be for disability, for race, crossing those lines, the earlier these kids can recognize where the boundaries are and say, these people are like me. They are just different with their abilities. So it's all about, again, perception and breaking down where we see these to be, no matter what capacity. I'm just like trying to point home, I know it a lot, but it's really important to me, and it's important to really seeing where the boundaries are.
So there are some, I confess the ones I mostly know are YA books, which take a racially ambiguous character, and in the movie versions they're whitened. For example, Katniss, or Hermione Granger, instead of being potentially biracial, she's played by Emma Watson. How can librarians deal with these whitenings?
I'm just going to pop in there for a second and say, I've actually found a lot of fan fiction which shows these characters reimagined as biracial, as African American or South American or Black, whichever, any kind of race that they are. It's all about having these kids kind of take these characters as, I wouldn't say part of themselves, but recognizing that literature, even though they may say, or not mention the race, they can kind of reclaim it in any way they want. It's just a matter of seeing that they can. And I mean, the matter that I see with a lot of YA or children's even, is that they say for people of color, that they mention their race, and for people who are white, they don't. It's really, again, boundaries. It's better running for you.
So, I mean, I think that those kind of blockbuster movie releases are actually a really great opportunity for libraries to do community engagements, right? Like, I know libraries will often do sort of like community read-alongs, right? So you know that the Divergent movie is coming out, or you know that the Hunger Games movie is coming out, and so you have programming organized around that, and one of the things that of course means is everybody reading the actual Hunger Games book, and I think that there's a great opportunity just to bring that up as a point of discussion, right? Like, teenagers can talk about this stuff, they're smart people, and so, if you're having a book group that's like, hey, okay, we're gonna all read this book together, and then maybe we'll all go see the movie, talk about it, right? I think often what happens is questions around race and discussions about race get silenced because they're uncomfortable, and I think it's actually really important, right? So that if you're leading that book group, you can be like, hey, wait a second, like, here's the description in the book, and here's the photo of the person playing it. Why do you think that happened? Why did they cast this person, right? And then the conversation cannot just be, that doesn't look like my picture based on this description. It can become a conversation about racism in Hollywood, right? And I think that's really important.
And jumping off that for 1 second, I've also done some work looking at the Hunger Games of my research that I want to do is looking at the erasure of disability in Hollywood. For example, with the Hunger Games, does anyone remember Peter loses a leg in the first book? And in the movie, he's fine. The worst part is that I didn't notice that until after I saw the movie, like a month after. I'm like, what just happened? What? And then in, which movie is it? Mockingjay, BT is in a wheelchair, and that does happen in the movie and in the book, I believe. But it's not discussed. So it's another thing where you can bring up the discussion. Why is it not talked about that he's in a wheelchair now, that he doesn't have this inability? And in the first movie, it was just totally erased. What is what? Yeah, it's really all that. But yeah.
So with that, I'm just jumping in as the timekeeper, just so you know that this discussion can keep going on, but there are snacks. And we also want to refuel so that at 15 minutes, we'll hear about all the works in progress. So once again, thank you.